Hey watch friends, today we're going to take a look at the latest offering from the micro brand RZE, and this is their Aspirare. This is a prototype that's loaned to the channel for review. However, this is going live for pre-order on June 14th of 2023, so shortly after this review is published. Before we dive into the watch itself, let's go ahead and take a quick look at the packaging and see how it ships. The packaging is very much in keeping with recent RZE models. You have the cardboard box on the outside, then as you slide that open, you have this pouch on the inside. You can see Velcro here, so you can add patches or anything along those lines. Zipper pouch on the side, zipper pouch here as well, so you can use that for storage. And then as you open it up, you have two slots here. You do technically have elastic to be able to fit 4 watches. However, with this style, I personally am not a huge fan of having them butted in like that, but this does give you options here, and I think it's in keeping with the adventure style of RZE. Alright, now that we have a better feel for how it ships, let's go ahead and dive straight into the watch. We'll initially knock out the specs, and then we'll take a deeper dive. I do want to mention up front, before we get into this is actually the largest watch by far that RZE has ever offered. How large is it? We'll get into the specs, of course, but as we go later into the video, we'll actually bring in some comps as well, just so you get the idea of the scale of this watch. This comes standard with their 2-year warranty, like other RZE watches. The case is coming in at 44 millimeters, measured roughly from the 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock position. I wouldn't necessarily let that scare you off if you typically don't like watches this large. However, I'm going to put an asterisk with that, and we'll talk about that in depth. The bezel is coming in dead on flush at 44 millimeters on my calipers. The lugs are a strap change friendly 22 millimeters. The lug to lug is definitely stretching it from my comfort zone, coming in at 53 millimeters. I think in keeping with the case, however, again, we'll look at comps there. The thickness on my calipers is coming in at 13.2 millimeters, and that is including this crystal. Which, speaking of the crystal, this is a flat sapphire crystal, which does have a solid application of inner AR coating, as we'll see as we go in the outdoor footage as well. The movement on this is the venerable Miyota 9015. It's one that I really like a lot. Higher beat, hacking, hand winding, around 42-hour power reserve, all that kind of good stuff. Nice movement choice. The water resistance, as you can see at the 6 o'clock position, is coming in at 300 meters or 30 atmospheres. As far as the weight, one of the things RZE is known for is producing titanium watches, and this one is no exception there. Their titanium typically means that it's going to be a very lightweight. However, given the scale and size of this watch, it's actually still tipping the scale at 150 grams. Not the lightest that we'll see, however, when we look at the Zelos Hammerhead, that one's coming in right in that same ballpark as well. Alright, so now that we have the basic specs out of the way, let's go ahead and take a deeper dive into this watch. First, the colors. This is available in 3 different options. There's the white we're looking at today, there's additionally a black version, and then there's a limited edition blue meteorite version as well, which is really slick. That's a PVD coated dial, similar to others that we've seen as well. The characteristics of the watches are going to be the same across the board. The most notable thing is going to be that it has a rather expansive dial, which again is in keeping with the 44mm size. Both the black and this white are going to have what I would describe as a snowy texture. You know, it's a gentle, like pebble type finish, but it's very tight in there. It's not really what I would call a satin. I think a snowy or sandy texture, but a very soft sand is accurate for that. This does have printing at the 12 o'clock position with their logo, and then again down at the 6 o'clock position with 2 lines of text, you have the water resistance as well as automatic. Also down at the 6 o'clock position, you'll see it does have a frame date window. I kind of like the choice here. They went with a contrasting so rather than a color match and went black for this with the white text. Legibility wise, I think white with black would have been a little better, but I appreciate that instead of trying to color match that white dial and having it be slightly off, that this actually leans into that, still keeps decent legibility, and it's a good look. That is framed around there with a nice clean cut-in framing. As you move out to the perimeter, you can see this does have a very steeply sloped rehaut, which has nice, very prominent for your 5-minute markers or 5-second markers, as well as your hashes in between. So excellent legibility there, and we'll talk about legibility more as we go through. Contributing to that legibility, you can see this handset is what I would describe as being a modified pencil. Out at the tips of both the hour and minute hand, you can see it abruptly cuts in, and it actually is blunted off at the tip as well. However, to me it is reminiscent of a pencil style. As for the second hand, it does have a trapezoid in the place of what would be typically the lollipop there, which I think again is keeping consistent with the overall theming. This particular variant has matte black for all of its hardware. As far as the markers, you have what I would describe as a tombstone marker at the 12 o'clock position, then you have trapezoids throughout the rest of the dial. They're going to be consistent with the exception of the 3, 6, and 9 position. The 3 and 9 are going to be elongated, and the 6 o'clock is going to be shortened down, but you still do have loom application all the way around. Which, speaking of the loom application is really quite unique on this. They have a mix of green and blue, which we've seen in the past. However, I like the way that they actually mix it up with the hands as well. It's in an uncommon kind of pattern there, which I think that's a pretty cool touch. But the biggest thing that I've been impressed with is not only does the loom actually seem to perform quite well, but that being said, they kept a very true to white. So during the daytime, you'll notice that the loom on this is actually keeping with that white all the way around. So even though it mixes up the color, they actually kept that consistency. If they had done something like a C3 and a BGW9, typically C3 has that more greenish hue to it, I think it would have looked very much clashing on, especially on this white variant, but I think on the black as well. So I really like that they did that. I think that was a good touch. Shifting over to the bezel on this with the dive styling is, as you would expect, a 120 click unidirectional bezel, and we'll listen to that action here momentarily. As we already looked at, it is flush to the case, so it comes right up to the end there. The cuts on this are what I would describe as like a scallop cut, as you can see, nicely milled as you go through, and we'll talk about the screw holes in just a second. As far as the bezel inserts, this particular one is a ceramic bezel insert. You can see a very unique double pip type of accent there. Then it has your hashes as well as your numerals going through for your first 20 minutes there, and then just continuing with every other with hash and alternating at the 10-minute increments for the rest of your numerals. As far as the action, let's go ahead and take a listen to that. Very nice tactile click. For being a titanium watch, I have to say I think this is pretty well dialed in. A lot of times you get a little bit more tinniness, and certainly this has a little bit of that, but I think for a titanium watch, I think it's pretty well dialed in. Additionally, not a ton of play. It does definitely have some play to it, as you can see there, but it settles in pretty nicely, and the alignment's pretty well spot on as well. I said we'd revisit those screws. As you might have noticed, you can see there's a screw there, a second one there, and then a third one there. What that is this actually has the ability to change out your bezel inserts simply by removing, or the bezels themselves rather, simply by removing those screws. It's kind of a neat construction. So first, let's get the visual here. So you can see this just gives that more washed out look. I'm going to go ahead and send that. More uniform there, more monochromatic to that washed out. It's kind of a negative term, but more of that kind of look. But one of the things that's neat is you can see this ridged part, which is your typical ratcheting on the inside. This actually stays on the watch. So when you remove that part's still in there. And then you can see those screws just come and set directly into that. So what you're actually doing is you're changing these external, sorry about that bump there, you're changing these external pieces on that with just those 3 screws. They are very tiny screws. They look larger until you get them loose, but they are very, very small, so do be aware of that. One of the things that's really cool is at launch, they'll actually be including an extra bezel insert, or an extra bezel rather, along with the watch. So you have 2 options. You can change up the look. Really cool touch there without having to refer back to my video on how to actually remove bezels themselves. Anybody can do this. All you need is a 1.2 millimeter screwdriver. I'll have a link to that down in the description. Highly encourage picking a good one up. I do want to mention after the launch, these will be for sale separately, or if you need a replacement, they'll be for sale separately for $50 as well, and we'll talk about detail pricing as we go through. All right, so now that we have a better feel for those pieces, let's shift over to the case. The case on this is very signature RZE style. This is what I would describe as softened angles. So you can see you have very pronounced chamfer cuts up at the top. Those are more acute angles there, though they still are softened edges. The case flow is a little more of a subtle curvature to it. However, it still, to me, gives the idea or the feel of having angles, even though it is kind of rounded out. So that's a little bit counterintuitive there. As far as the finishing, on this one they did mix it up from in the past. You've seen many that are just blasted, and then we've started recently seeing some more brush. This one actually has, as you can see here, vertical brushing running along the side of the case, and then it does actually have blasting as well. As with other RZEs, this is going to be hardened coating, so you have their Ultra Hex coating, which takes this up to 1200 Vickers. So despite being titanium, you still have excellent scratch resistance, and that's applied all the way around on this, as we'll look at that. We already talked about the chamfers and overall cuts. That does continue over to the lugs itself, and you can see on the exterior of the lugs, there is a drilled lug hole as well. And then shifting over to the 3 o'clock side, you can see that this one does have a 4 o'clock crown, which I think with being with the larger case, that's going to keep this from digging into a lot of wrists out there. So I think that's a welcome call, and we'll see the hammerhead win a similar direction with that as well. We didn't look at the downturn of the lugs. As you can see, it comes just slightly above the case back there, but it's very close to coming all the way down. As far as the crown itself, this is coming in at 7.4 millimeters. It is a screw down crown, as you'd expect for a dive style watch. It has their typical very wide gear type milling on the exterior there, and it has a very nicely signed logo, as you can see, very prominently milled in and raised there, so I think that's a nice accent touch. Shifting over to the case back. The case back on this, as we've seen in the past, is a screw-in construction. It is a relatively plain titanium, and I don't believe it has the hardened coating. So as you can see on this one, the prototype has been pretty well scuffed up from the bracelet. It additionally has minimal text as you go throughout the border, but overall, it's a pretty simplistic case back. Shifting over to the bracelet on this tapers from 22 millimeters at the lugs down to 20 millimeters at the clasp. As you can see, it does have female end links, so that has a nice drop as it goes straight down into the wrist. The links themselves are very short in construction, which that really lends to overall comfort as well as articulation, so that's a nice touch. Just like the case, this of course is going to be coated, but additionally it has that blasted texture or finish that we saw on the case as well, so nice continuity there. The link shape is what I would describe as somewhat of a hybrid. It's an H-link construction, however it does have kind of a W at the top of the links where that actually mates in with the center link. Speaking of the center links, they do sit proudly of the outer links. So it's a really neat and interesting cut. You really see those angles as you check this out from the side profile, and I think that's a cool look. Additionally, this does carry over with that angular finish across the board. So you've got sharp angles all the way around, though again, it is relatively softened. So that carries for each of the links, and it, I think, mates nicely with the case. The bracelet is held in with screws. Again, you'll be able to use that. Same 1.2 for the bezel, as well as the links themselves. And on the production version, this will have quick release spring bars that are absent on this prototype, so it's something to be aware of. As far as the clasp, this is an evolution for RZE. They are now using toolless micro adjust clasp. We actually saw that recently on the Endeavor, which I'll bring in here momentarily, and we'll have a review coming of that one soon as well with their latest iteration. But this is going to be a double pusher construction. You can see it is signed, nice blasted finish there, chamfer cut, a little bit of shine going on the exterior edge there. Push those double pushers, you have milling on the inside. But the biggest thing that you're going to notice is they're now bringing you over like a Christopher Ward or Zelos style with the toolless micro adjust. We've seen this in the past. You can see it as ratcheting style. And then click that out and we can check out. So you can see this carries through directly with the bracelet continuity as far as the overall aesthetic for that, which I know many like. And then additionally, since it is ratcheting, you can actually close it and tighten it up on the wrist directly, which is a nice touch there as well. So that's a great addition, and I'm happy to see them going in that direction. All right, so now that we have a better feel for the watch itself, let's go ahead and bring in some of the comps I mentioned. First, this is the Zelos Hammerhead 3, and this is their titanium version that just recently launched as well, and we do have the full review of that if you care to go back and check it out. This just gives you an idea, though, of the overall presence of these two. So here it is as far as the thickness. This gives you an idea of the profile. As you can see, this one has, I think, a lot more prominence to it as far as the overall presence. Not a huge differential in thickness, though it is definitely there. I believe this is about 1.5 millimeters thicker. The biggest thing that you're going to notice, though, is that with the Hammerhead, this has a 44 millimeter case as well. So these case size are going to be very similar. However, this one does have very much a step down bezel. So you can see this wears a lot smaller. Additionally, this has a much shorter lug to lug, so you can notice a very significant difference there. It's more so in person than you're probably picking up on camera, but it's a very significant difference. I believe it's to the tune of about 4 millimeters, if I recall correctly. So that is very noticeable, especially on smaller wrists like myself, but that gives you an idea of the wrist presence differential between those. For those reasons, I do think the Hammerhead is a little more size versatile for smaller wristed folks like myself. As we saw in the footage there on the wrist, it's definitely pushing my limits. Here it is next to the RZE Endeavor, and this is one of their Glacier series that, again, we'll be reviewing here shortly. But you can see here, the idea as far as just the dial presence and size, this I really think dwarfs that Resolute, which this is, or that Endeavor rather, which that's coming in at around 40 millimeters, I believe, for that. So you can see huge differential there. And then bringing in one kind of in the middle, this is a Henry Archer Nordless. And you can see this one has a little more of an expansive dial for the size, but this is 42 millimeters, and that gives you an idea there as far as the visual presence. I think this really wears quite large as far as the dial presence. This one is still very expansive, but with that rehot, it does somewhat deceive you a little bit there as the way that cuts down. All right, so there you have it for some comps as well to give you an idea as far as the overall scaling and size. Now that we have all that out of the way, let's go ahead and wrap things up with my personal view of the positives, some critiques, as well as the overall summary. First, for the positives, especially on this variation, the legibility is absolutely spot on. This thing is to the max with legibility. At a glance, that heavy contrast, that large dial presence, the nice hashes, the good length, all that kind of stuff, very great legibility. The bezel concept, I really think is slick. I like the ability to be able to just kind of pop these off at whim. It really takes literally under a minute to do. Just back those 3 screws out, pop that off, pop the other one on, pop the screws in, and you're done. That's, I think, a really cool touch. And the fact that they're including an extra one at launch is nice as well. The weight, despite the fact that I said this isn't as light as many of the RZEs are, at 150 grams, it's comparable to that Hammerhead that we looked at. And I think in titanium, if this were in stainless steel, it would be well over 200 grams for that. So I think that is pretty respectable there for a watch of this size. The construction is very stout. RZE touts themselves as being adventure-ready watches, and I think this one feels like an adventure-ready watch. You definitely notice it on wrist. Doesn't weigh you down, but it does feel like RZE typical construction. As far as the toolless micro, we already talked about that. Love the fact that they moved in this direction. Want to see everybody do so there, so that's great. But as far as some of the critiques, the first one I want to address right off the bat, because I know many people are going to bring it up, is the pricing. This one is coming in at $599 at launch. That does include the extra bezel. However, that one is going to be a little bit on the pricier side compared to some of the comps. Like when we look at that Zelos Hammerhead, the fact that that one's coming in at $429 at launch versus this one, pardon the dog's barking, at this one at $599. This does have a Miyota, whereas that has an NH movement, so certainly those kind of things. And I don't personally think that it's a bad value, but that being said, it's somewhat of the elephant in the room, and I know many people are going to bring that up, so I do want to be upfront about addressing that one. As far as the size of the watch, this is something that for larger wristed folks or people who enjoy larger watches, that's absolutely going to be appealing to you. The fact that this is a 44 millimeter watch, it's definitely outside of the typical RZE fare, and it's really bucking somewhat of the industry trend where we've been going towards the smaller side. However, if you are like me and do have a smaller wrist, while I do think this is more wearable than the specs would denote, on my 6.5-inch wrist, as you can see, that lug to lug really does kick out there. It definitely wears larger than I personally would like, and for that reason, I'll be sitting this one out. However, that's just owing to my preference as well as my wrist size. That's not to steer you away. If you like watches of this size or not. And then the bezel screws, while this is a really cool concept for the bezels, I don't necessarily love that you can see these visible screws as a result of that. Is it worth the trade-off? It's really a judgment call for you. It's one of those things that I don't hate it, but you do have it very prominently, especially with that one being right at the 6 o'clock position. You do always have that, so as you kind of roll your wrist and as you glance, you always see that screw. It's not a big deal. Some of the expensive luxury watches out there have screws directly on the bezel face, and I'm sure you know some of the ones I'm talking about. So that being said, it's just a stylistic thing. For me, I don't love it, but I do think it's a cool concept overall. All right, so where does that leave us? At the end of the day, it's great to see RZE kind of mixing things up. I really think they're trying to branch out and innovate, or at least push out with the industry trends for having toolless micro. I love the fact that they're going with a larger side, despite the fact that it is an industry trend, and despite the fact that I just said it's not personally for me because of my wrist size. I like them seeing a versatility or a diverse selection as well. So I think that's cool. And at the end of the day, I like that they're keeping their DNA. This one does still very much feel like an RZE, despite the fact that it really mixed things up in so many respects with the bezel as well as with the overall sizing. So there you have it. I hope this has helped you with making your decision when this launches on June 14th. If you did like this, please do tap that like button. Additionally, if you haven't already done so, give that subscribe button a tap. And finally, drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. Are you glad to see a move in this direction? Is this one too large for you? Do you have a particular color preference? I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for watching.